Welcome today to Reclaiming My Mind podcast. I'm your host, Ken Cook, sitting in today for Miss Jessica Vaughn, who normally hosts the podcast, but today will be our guest. I did want to point out that Jessica has not been provided with the questions beforehand today. This is straight just like we do with any other candidate, and I just wanted to be sure that everybody understood that. As I said, our guest today is Ms. Jessica Vaughn. She was the founder and past president of the Democratic Progressive Caucus of Tampa Bay. She's a school teacher, a certified school teacher. She is a substitute teacher now and candidate for the Hillsborough County School Board for District 3. Just want to welcome Jessica Vaughn. Thank you for being with us today, Jessica. I certainly appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for agreeing to interview me so that I can have an opportunity to be on the show. It feels really surreal to be on this side of it. So I'm excited to see what our candidates normally go through. And thank you so much for taking on the role of the main interviewer to provide our audience this opportunity.
Well, my pleasure, Jessica, as usual. As I've said before, this gives me an opportunity to do some research on things that I never would have before. So
Right.
Thank you again. So, we usually start these. We will certainly get into your campaign and what you're doing that and how people can help your campaign. But we always like to start these off with a little bit more personal insight into Jessica. So how about just tell us about yourself a little bit?
Oh, good question. Well, thank you. It's something that I've had to grow in getting comfortable talking about myself. So a little bit about myself. I have always been extremely active and kind of an activist, especially in my 20s and in my 30s. While I was going to school and figuring out what I wanted to be and realized that I had a passion for education, I graduated from HCC and then I went to the University of South Florida and I got my degree in elementary education. And then I started teaching at Kenley Elementary at an achievement school, found out I was pregnant, and then started substitute teaching after my son was born. And actually decided that I loved being a sub because I could be flexible in my schedule to make sure that I was able to do the community organizing that I'd gotten involved with, as well as staying in the classroom and teaching the kids, which is the best part of being a teacher, but also being able to see a variety of different classrooms, of different schools, try different positions. It's given me such a diverse experience from the educational standpoint that I really like that. So since I started substitute teaching and my son started getting a little bit older, I started being interested more in politics from the inside. I had worked on a few of my friends' campaigns, and that had started my political interest from the inside. And then in 2016, I got really motivated to start working inside the party and passionate about, progressive issues. And then I formed, as you mentioned, the Democratic Progressive Caucus, which is a caucus that works inside the Democratic Party to make sure that we're, supporting the principles in the Democratic platform, such as supporting public education, racial justice, workers' rights, environmental rights, healthcare for all, issues that I feel like are important to our country and our community. And then within my own community, I felt like there weren't enough voices representing my community in Tampa Palms. I live in New Tampa. And so in 2016, I also ran for my CDD board, which for people who aren't familiar with CDDs, they're essentially in the suburbs when developers build communities, they allot extra taxes that the members of those communities pay that provide for extra infrastructure. And since those are city, taxes, you actually have to be elected publicly on the ballot to sit on that board. And we have a $5 million budget where we manage the infrastructure within our community. And so I've been really involved in so many things outside of that involve community organizing, whether it's supporting different groups or the parties or issues I care about, while being a full-time mom, while being a substitute teacher and being elected to boards. Because now that I'm not the president of the Progressive Caucus, I sit on the boards and I still help organize our meetings and make sure I'm a voice on there. So I've been very busy. Aside from that side of me, personally, I love photography. I love filmmaking. I'm very into documentaries and documentary making. We love to travel. I'm a foodie. You'll often see pictures of my food or my meals on my social media. And a giant animal rights advocate. I love animal rights. We've recently fostered and adopted a dog from the Humane Society, and we've fostered it throughout my life. So that's a little bit about me.
Well, great. Thank you very much. By the way, I've seen pictures of that little new fostered puppy you've got, and she's cute as she can be.
Oh, thanks.
Well, let's talk a little bit more to educate our listeners, I think, here about the school board.
Mm-hmm.
What does it do? What does it cover? How is it important in the total running of our schools here in Hillsborough County?
So that's a good question. And, depending on who you ask, even sometimes on the board, of the people who sit on the board, those questions vary. So essentially, it's to make our policies regarding the school board. Policies can go anywhere from, how we handle discipline actions to dress codes to, basically the running of our schools. And then secondarily, it's to manage the budget. We get all of this money from taxes and from appraisals and the federal government and, property taxes. And then we have to allocate how much of that is going to go towards, paying our teachers, how much of it is going to go towards busing, how much is it going to go towards supplies. So managing the budget is a huge piece of it. But then I think also making sure that we're connecting to the communities and we're being reflective so that we can advocate for educational policies and also go back to the state legislature and be a liaison for our community, to the legislation about what's important educationally. So, the school board is very important, even for people who don't have children, because one, you're paying for it with your taxes. And two, how we educate our youth denotes what kind of society and community we're going to have as these youths develop and become our leaders. So making sure that they get good education should be on the forefront of everybody who lives within a community.
So, after having said all that, what really made you run for school board in the first place? I know you're busy with a lot of other things. Why take on this extra responsibility?
Well, it wasn't a decision I made lightly, honestly. Originally, I jumped into school board race 6 because I was just really tired of seeing our democratically elected school board members vote against our democratic platform. And for me, I felt like since I'm an educator, since I'm so passionate about education in general, for me, when I was looking at all the elected offices, that was the one I was most drawn to. And then I really had to wrestle with, could I have more impact as an elected official or as an activist? Because, once you start running for office, you have to worry about your public image. And sometimes you have to make sure that you're censoring yourself. And, so I really eternally struggled with it. But finally, what motivated me to action was thinking about putting my money where my mouth is. For the last how many years I've been advocating to push our politicians and our elected officials to be, more inclusive, more transparent, more progressive. And meanwhile, we have a deficit of people who are willing to do that and run for office because it is such a intense experience. And so it was time to kind of put my money where my mouth was. And instead of, sitting around being like, why don't we have more good people running for office? It was time for me to step up. And I really had to also evaluate, is this the right fit for me? And so I thought about my organization, my organizing experience. I thought about my experience managing a budget and working within my CDD board and working with, members who aren't necessarily politically aligned with me and what we've created. And then as well as being in the classroom, being an educator, too many people, unfortunately, use the school board as a political stepping stone, and they don't really care that much about education. It's just an easy office to run for. And we even have candidates right now who are being groomed to take over county commission seats. And this is just the stepping board. And, they focus on financial responsibility, and they have no idea what goes into, being a holistic educator and what we should be advocating for in the classrooms or how to support teachers. And I'm so tired of seeing those people run our school board into the ground. So all of that was just what finally made me ready to commit and give my all to it.
Well, good. Thank you for letting us know that. Let me ask a kind of a follow-up question about the responsibilities of the school board here a little bit.
Yeah.
The school board is, how, if you can explain how the school board might be superseded by the state legislators. I mean, we have control of schools here in Hillsborough County up to a point, but then there are also state laws and state school boards. How do they supersede what we do here in Hillsborough County?
That's a good question. And again, depending on who you ask, even people who sit on the board, you get different answers. How much control and autonomy do we have? The clearest answer is obviously with the funding and the budget. They denote how much funding we get. Sometimes they have to, define how we spend it. In 2018, they passed a legislation which mandated a certain proportion of our budget only go towards charter schools, and within that mandate, they also put a caveat that charter schools could hire teachers right out of high school, that you didn't have to have a college education anymore to be a teacher, and that you could change the requirements to certify to become a teacher. So kind of watering down the qualifications that you need to be a teacher within charter schools specifically. So it really depends on, it really comes down to mostly the funding, but there are always different caveats that they could put, when they want to mandate whether or not we're going to have drills, school shooter drills or not, and how we're going to, respond to that kind of threat within our classroom. That comes down from the state legislation. Also teachers' ability to organize, when we're talking about teacher unions, they don't have the right to strike in Florida. It's a right to work state, and also it's written into our Constitution. So, the legislation has a hand in making sure that we follow that, constitutionally.
So that people understand the school board is just not autonomous. They have to follow the laws and everything else like everyone else, right? Absolutely,
but there are always caveats within policies that you can enact to kind of fine tune and make those laws, just as anyone knows who's a lawyer, laws are always subjective, right? The wording can always be interpreted in certain ways. So there are certain things that you can do. Like when we were talking about curriculum, we don't control the curriculum. The state mandates which standards we're going to follow educationally, but there are definitely focuses that the school board can put on how that curriculum is laid out, what we're studying, like Lynn Gray was talking about, how she's really advocating making sure we have a more holistic education focused around, African American and Black history, to make sure that we're filling in those missing pieces that might be within the standards that aren't focused on. So we always have that ability to make the policies customize a little bit more of, what we want to see within Hillsborough County.
Well, you also do have the control of the superintendent.
Yes.
Of the schools as well, correct? And was it last year we brought in a new superintendent to the school system?
Yes.
So what is that? I know that you're not serving currently, but what do you see as that relationship with the superintendent?
So the school board, approves the policy and the budget, and then the superintendent has to enact that and build the infrastructure based around those policies, and then also come back with suggestions about policy changes. He's really in charge of the personnel, making sure, that the infrastructure is being carried out within our school. He's really responsible for, implementing everything. So it's an interesting relationship.
Right. And not unlike any large business. I mean, you have your policymakers and your executive boards, and then you have, management that carries that on down and really makes it work. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about is, the recent COVID-19 crisis
Mm-hmm.
has really shown some glaring issues, I think, regarding our technology here in Hillsborough County and particularly in remote learning in our country, as well as in our county. What should the school board do to address those issues?
So that's a really, really challenging question, because when you look at what parents want, parents have all different needs. And recently, I've posed these questions publicly, and I've gotten a lot of different feedback from parents who, didn't necessarily love our virtual learning, but are so terrified of their children coming in contact with the virus and making sure that they protect their children. They want full virtual learning. Whereas I have other parents who are single parents, who have to work. They don't have the luxury of staying home with their children, who feel like they have no other options, that if they didn't have, in school where they could drop their children off, they rely on it for childcare, and they feel, that they want that option. So I think, when you look at what the superintendent has just recently said, there were 3 different options. And one was, essentially kind of doing a combo where the kids at like a 2-week period maybe come in for 5 days a week and do virtual learning for the other 4 days so that there are smaller classrooms. One of them was something where like only the kids A through L attended somehow, and the other kids were virtual learners, and maybe that could be customized individually. And then there was, either just going right back to school full time, trying to be extra safe as far as maybe providing masks or, sanitary things and being extra clean. So I think they're kind of waiting to see, are we going to have a second surge, what it's going to look like in August. And that's the most challenging part, right? Is that this virus depends on how people act and how seriously they take it. And we can't predict that and what that's going to mean in August. Personally, from the feedback that I've gotten from listening to parents, I like an option where you have the choice, that if you feel like you need that child care and you want to put your child in school, and that's a risk that you personally want to make for your family and you feel comfortable with that, you have that option. And that if that's not something that you feel comfortable with at all, that you have the option of keeping your child home, and there is an alternative virtual option. Or if you want to do a hybrid, you can do that too. That basically, and it puts more challenging needs on, being able to build this infrastructure. But I think that's how we should be, and how we should be responsive like that. But if you want to, say, hey, Monday, I'm okay with sending my kid to school, but I want them to have the virtual options on these days because that works best for my family, that you have that option, and there should be a way using technology where teachers can basically put their lessons that they're going to do for the school day online, and they can also record themselves doing it and put those within Etsy or whichever, platform that we're going to use. And then, if parents want to stay at home, want their kids to be at home, they have that options of engaging as much as they want to.
Well, I certainly agree with what you've said. What we've seen, though, is that we were pretty much caught flat-footed in Hillsborough County.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of places were, but we were caught flat-footed, and I guess that's one of the questions I'd have is this is an emergency type situation,
mm-hmm.
which we addressed as a school board member. How can you address in keeping us and making sure that we have planning and that sort of thing for emergency situations? We have hurricane season. We have a lot of different emergencies that could happen here in Florida.
Yeah. I mean, the superintendent would say we already have a virtual school that's set up, that it has a capacity to go up to 3,000 students. Even I think he mentioned if we stretched it, it could go up to 30,000 students. Right now, there's only 300 students who are taking advantage of it. So, the school board seems to be evaluating whether funneling students whose parents feel more comfortable in a virtual situation through virtual school. The problem is then that affects our funding in Hillsborough County and the funding that we get for those students. We actually lose funding for those students because it goes to the virtual school, even though they're Hillsborough County residents. So that's kind of, when you look at what's complicating everything, it always comes back to money, right? So yeah, I think that as being a teacher in the classroom, making sure that we have relationships with the teachers, with parents, and really engaging our community as much as possible is the most important way to be able to advocate for what we should be doing. And unfortunately, I feel like whether it's just based on, the sheer bureaucracy or the dynamics of it, the school board doesn't really, as I've seen, engage parents and teaching staff enough to kind of make these decisions and figure out the best route. That there's a disconnect between the school board and teachers. Sometimes there's a lot of contention that there's a disconnect between parents and the school board, and that we're not really being reflective and engaging these people in the conversation to make these decisions. It's all like they're waiting to see and somebody's working on it and we'll get the information out to you. And now there are surveys, right? There are surveys that they take that where people can contribute. And I've seen a lot of surveys go out for sure. But, there's a difference between how much information you invest in a survey and how much information you invest in a forum, or if you're able to speak at the school board, or, how much that you can invest. Some of those surveys have automated answers, or, you get them when you're trying to multitask. So there's a difference between just sending out surveys and actually, holding forums or events, or sitting down with teachers in a Zoom meeting and say, tell me what your experience is. Tell me how we could have supported you. Tell me where the failures were. So I think making sure that we keep that connection with the people that we're representing is important for being a strong advocate. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, you did actually. And it brings me to another question that I have. And, one of the things I see is, I think, a lack of accessibility to the board.
Yeah.
How can the board be more accessible to our community?
Well, honestly, that's one of the forefronts of my platform is accessibility, transparency, being reflective. I think kind of the difference between a politician and a civil servant is that connection right there of making sure that you understand that what your job is to be elected to reflect your constituency, your county, the people who actually elected you. And unfortunately, as you become more involved in politics, it becomes more insular and more insular and more insular. And I feel like it's a struggle to stay connected and something that politicians really have to do. Specifically as the board, and I've said this, it's an easier fix, is make meeting times and more accessible. I mean, for years, teachers have been begging the school board to change the meeting times. They have been at either 3 to 4, somewhere around that time on a Tuesday, which is the only day Hillsborough County teachers are contracted to stay at their school for extra trainings if they need to. That time frame is the antithesis of getting teacher and supporting school staff's feedback when you come to talking about the school board. So I think making them at a time that's more convenient for people to be engaged is important. Previous school board members have said, oh, well, we've tried other times. We've moved them to 7 o'clock. We don't get a lot of engagement. But honestly, unless there's something that's really, passionate within the community, you don't get a lot of engagement at 3 or 4 o'clock either. Sometimes I've gone into those meetings and I've been the only person in the room. And so also, if you tried it once, it was a different environment 5 years ago to how much community engagement people have. So we shouldn't be afraid to try those things again, just because maybe one time 5 or 6 or 8 years ago, we didn't get the engagement that we want. I also think, it should not necessarily just be up to the school board members to hold forums within their community, that the school board as a whole should do that, setting up different forums, moving the meetings around to different communities. Sometimes people just can't get downtown, regardless of what time of day it is. We're a gigantic county. We're the 7th largest county. Sometimes it could take an hour to get from one end to the other. Not everybody has the luxury of being able to go down there and do that. I think that we we have, we broadcast the meetings, and that's really good. That's allowed me to participate in the meetings during this time of COVID where I'm self-isolating and not leaving. But at some point, our chair has, taken public comment out of the meetings, which is a huge part of those meetings, is again, being reflective and seeing what the public wants. So making sure that we're committed to broadcasting those entire meetings. And I think that having a bigger social media presence is important. These days, especially, so much engagement happens on social media. Even when you post an article, what do you think? How can we get your feedback on this? Really leaning into the community and educating them about why this is important and connecting, and we could also show up at more events and just really outreaching into communities, I think, is the important part.
Okay, thank you. Because I do agree. I think we don't, in the communities just simply do not see the school board members enough, in my opinion. But wanted to ask you another question here, though. Our current situation in our country regarding mass shootings raises the question of safety for our children. Mm-hmm. How can the board improve safety in our schools?
That is such a good question. And regardless of what community I talk to, safety is always at the forefront of equally of every community when you say, what are you concerned with? So when we talk about safety, are we just talking about the threat of mass shooters? That's complicated because I can tell you right now, as somebody who's in our school all year round, those mass shooting drills are traumatic, being in a classroom, getting a code word, all of a sudden having to make sure that every single opening is closed, parting your classroom, getting the children into position, making sure they're absolutely quiet while, you hear someone going through the hallways and trying to bang on the doors and get in the classroom is so traumatizing. And that happens not just, quarterly, but that happens once a month at least, if not more. And those drills are very traumatic on our students. They're very traumatic on our teachers. So when we're talking about school shootings in general, I'm from the mind frame that we need to make sure that we're talking about responsible gun reform and people's accessibility to weapons. But also, we have to make sure that our schools are holistically supporting, students, because many times these shootings are done by somebody who's attended that school, or a disgruntled student, or somebody who felt like an outsider or didn't get the resources that they needed when they were going through school, And so I think that the focus when we're talking about how do we make our schools safe, specifically with school shootings, is making sure that we're having equitable, nurturing environments where students feel supported and loved, and that they have safe places to go to. If we're just talking about school safety in general, we need to make sure that our schools are, one, toxic free. We need to look at the things that we're using within our schools. We need to make sure our students have clean drinking water. There's been questions about whether the drinking water within our schools has lead in it and whether or not it's even safe for students. We need to be talking about nutrition and making sure that we're focusing on students' nutrition, because what's going into their bodies has a direct effect on their health and their ability to learn. So I think when we talk about safety, we have to look at our schools and investing into them holistically and making sure that they're a nurturing, safe environment for every student, regardless of which school that they go to. And that also opens up the doorway to talking about equity when we're funding schools and prioritizing them. But that might lead to another question. So,
well, no, and that is another question. You've certainly answered that one for me, but how do we advocate to get more equitable funding? I mean, I obviously don't see the actual budget,
right.
But we have schools, and this is getting into another subject perhaps. We have schools, in fact, in Hillsborough County, we have the highest rate of failing schools of any county in the state. And some of that has to do with the funding that these schools are getting. So how do we get more equitable funding?
So that's a really good question, and something that I've been exploring and trying to figure out, because like you said, it's not very transparent exactly how the school funding is divided up. And if you've talked to other school board members, they say that right now we actually allocate more money for achievement schools. And I think we've kind of touched on that even if there's more funding, if those schools have, bigger needs to begin with, then it's not actual equitable funding. So I think number one, charter schools are taking a huge portion of our money to build these new schools and to develop. So I think prioritizing public education and settling on that's what we want to invest in and make sure that we're making equitable is something that we all have to agree on, how important public education is. Two, I think we need to be honest about the inequities within these schools and these communities to begin with. Like I mentioned, even if you have a little bit more money coming into your school, if you have worse lighting to begin with, unsafe sidewalks on the outside, you have a deficit when it comes to resources that a lot of PTA groups supply for other, schools that have more access to support, and you're having to, put in more paper towels or hand sanitizer or pencils because you don't get those, supplied to you from teacher and parent organizations, that it's not really equitable. So we need to realistically relook at allocating the budget realistically based on the needs of the schools to make sure that we're giving extra support to these schools that need it. And other, schools with more resources might object to that, right? Because in those communities, everybody wants to make sure that they're getting their fair share. But the issue comes is when you have these drastic inequities, it hurts us all as a society. And there are so many parents who maybe you live in the suburbs now, and you don't care about this, but your job relocates and you want to move to, Seminole Heights or something that's closer to the urban core. And then all of a sudden you're realizing that the district that you're moving into is completely different from the district that you have come from. And you're struggling all of a sudden to find, alternative education. You wouldn't have to do that if our schools were all equitable and good and supported and nurtured. Now that's also goes into the complexities of the communities and how the communities aren't equitable and what that looks like when we talk about community schooling. But again, I think that's going to be another question.
Well, it is, but I guess on this particular question, even though we fund equitably, that doesn't mean that we're always getting the best teachers, the best teachers or the teachers that are really needed into those schools. Sure. Is there any way to help do that? Because I think that's where a lot of these are failing, is the fact that they're, and I'm sorry, I'd hate to just dump it on the teachers.
That's okay. We're used to
it. Well, I mean, and it's not just their problem.
Sure.
But the fact is that we've got to get better teachers into those schools so that they can really teach and really do the job that we're expecting of them. And we've got to fund them as well. I mean, you can't expect somebody to go into a school that doesn't have air conditioning, that has poor water, that has, all the infrastructure issues, not only just the teachers, but the students themselves.
Absolutely.
They have to be in a good environment to be able to put their best forward.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say is that I go into achievement schools all the time, and there are some really great teachers in those schools. What a challenge is within those schools, even if you're a fantastic teacher, you're wearing a lot more hats than teachers in schools with more resources. You are not only supposed to be the teacher, sometimes you're the nurse, sometimes you're the mental counselor to students who, experience trauma on a daily basis. Sometimes you're mommy because, there's not a mommy around. There's so many different roles that you have to become, just like you said, to get these students up to the same learning ability that students with more resources and more support have, that you're always a step behind just to start off with. If the first thing when your kid comes into school, you have to say, have you eaten? Where's your jacket? Let me look at your hands. Why do you have that rash? Let me send you down to the nurse. When you're doing all of these things, just to make sure your students are ready to learn, it's a huge challenge. Also, a lot of teachers might shy away from working in schools like that because you just don't have as much support. You don't have access to supplies that you need in your classroom. I've gone into schools where I can't even make copies. Like, they don't have enough resources to make copies to provide the students with the materials they would need for those lessons. A lot of times you don't feel like you have the emotional support. And a lot of times these schools are where first year students come, it's all the other schools are filled. These are the schools that have a need and a lot of job openings. So you get a lot of first year students within these schools, or sometimes there are teachers who have felt very comfortable and it's probably their time to move on, but they kind of skate by at these schools. So it's a mixture of things, but I don't want to say like there aren't amazing teachers within these schools, because there absolutely are. But when they don't have the same support, whether it's community support for their students, financial support, resources that they need, they're always going to be behind.
Well, and I agree with that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Oh no, that's okay.
Make it all the teachers' fault, because
Sure.
I don't think it is.
Sure.
There are a lot of things. I do feel though that, frankly, over the last 5 or 6 years, there seem to be some improvements in those schools, but we're still having the highest number of failed schools in the state. Just appalls me.
Well, here's another piece, and I'm not defending the fact that we have failing schools. We absolutely do, for sure. But a lot of these grades are based on standardized testing. Right. And so I don't feel like, as somebody who's been in the classroom, a standardized test is an accurate snapshot of a student's achievement, how much they've learned, based on some inequities that they might have, how much they've grown. So I don't necessarily think it's fair to use that as the only measure of whether a school is successful or not. But I will say that there is a direct association between a school's grade and how much equity it has, how much funding it has, the community support that it has. So there's definitely, some connection between the holistic health of a child and their ability to be successful on a test, for sure. But there are a lot of communities where, students just aren't going to be as familiar with test taking, in a lot of communities that has access to resources, there are tutors. Kids put parents put their students in all of these extra programs that get them ready and prepared to take these tests, or that, get them into rote learning, and they reinforce that. So those students might perform better on a test, but that doesn't mean that, they're learning more or they're growing more. So I think that how we judge schools has to move away from standardized testing, and we have to find more holistic ways of evaluating student growth.
Well, I agree. I think one of the things I noticed when my education and re-educating myself about the school system and what I was seeing there, one of the things we know is reading is a fundamental skill.
Yes.
And yet we continue to see poor scores in this area in a lot of schools. How do you feel we could improve those reading scores, and probably more importantly, the reading literacy as opposed to the scores in our education system?
That's a hard question. I have a lot of thoughts on that. Reading is absolutely fundamental, and you see that especially as a teacher. There are so many times that I go into some of these achievement schools and, I give out, an assignment, and there are so many students in, upper grades that should be able to read who can't even read the instructions. So much of being successful in school comes with reading, critical thinking skills, understanding what the assignment is telling you, being able to gather information from the instructions to make sure you're doing it right. So you're right. It's so important. Part of reading literacy also, though, it revolves around the access to literature that you have, the access you have to being able to read different things and build on those skills is so important. Like when I was in college, one of the things that I learned is sometimes students' ability to read and comprehend information is directly linked to how many books they have at the house, how much access to literature they have. So while I think we need to focus on making sure that we're breaking down those skills in early learning, and making sure that people have access to early learning, because if a student is given the right tools to learn phonics and the breakdown of phonics and, have those reading skills, whether it's, learning blends or learning to put together blends or different tools that teachers have, the younger that students have access to that information, the more successful readers they're going to be, but also making sure that we talk about how important having access to literature is, and how we have to really change the way that we look at reading, that it's not, just a skill. Sometimes when I was in the classroom, I would have, parents come to me and say, my student is struggling to read, but they really like this, graphic novel, and I don't think that's, material that they should be reading. And you would say, let them read whatever they're interested in, whether it's a cereal box, whether it's, a graphic novel. Give them as much support when it comes to devouring information by reading it as possible. And I think that needs to be our focus educationally as a community. There are so many skills of chunking down things and reading skills that we could be reinforcing and making sure that parents understand and know how to support that, and focusing on what, reading really looks like. And another piece that I like is my son is neurodiverse and went to Montessori, and they taught him to read in Montessori in a completely different way. So instead of learning the letter names, right, A, B, C, D, every time you saw a letter, you learned its phonetic sound. So when he first started recognizing letters, it wasn't like A, it was like ah. It wasn't a B, it was B. So right away, they don't have to take that second step in connecting the letter name to the sound, because that's part of what you do when you teach reading. You say, what does A say? It says ah. What does B say? It says buh, because the students don't necessarily learn the letter sounds in order that they're developmentally appropriate. So looking at some of those techniques when it comes to reading and making sure that we're up to date on our reading skills are also critical when we're talking about making sure that we're creating strong readers from the get-go.
Well, I certainly agree with that. I think getting students started earlier, making sure that they are encouraged, as you said, whatever they want to read, encourage them and move them along, I think is very important.
Yeah, we need a whole literacy campaign. People should be donating books to these schools. People should be making sure that these are accessible. We should make reading cool again.
Well, and that brings up a question. We talk about the schools, but the schools are not independent of the communities. The schools are not independent of all the other government entities that deal with Hillsborough County. Yep. Yet people tend to feel that they are segregated, if you will. Mm-hmm. The city of Tampa, the board of county commission, the school board. How would you, as a board member, bring those entities together to try and homogenize the impact that they're having and not just in our schools, but in our communities to help get that support for our schools? How would you try to bring those entities all together and have them working in the same direction instead of in 3 or 4 different directions?
Well, I will say from what I've been privy to, it does seem like these boards are working more together just holistically more now. And I think that's because as people have become more engaged, we've outlined some issues that we value within the politicians that we're electing. And I think kind of making sure that we have politicians who are elected that are more politically aligned makes it easier for them to work together in that capacity of supporting our communities. So it sounds like, the Hillsborough County Commission Board, they have a lot of overlap with the school board when it comes to land use. And that's something that we can get into when we talk about charter schools and why, figuring out, if there are developers who are pushing these charter schools, why that's an important conversation to have. But I think it comes down to,
Well,
yeah.
Go ahead. Why don't we talk a little bit about the charter schools and other alternative solutions?
Yes, let me just touch on this. So I think that, it's about holistically caring about our communities, right? And when we talk about inequity, especially within schools, a lot of the times the models that come up are community schooling and making sure that we're investing in our communities as much as we're investing in our schools when we're talking about inequity, because the community is reflective of the school and that's where our students are coming from. So I think when we're talking about making this all, holistically together, we have to be building relationships with every part of our municipalities that care about equality and building infrastructure, the same amount of infrastructure within our communities to make sure that they're thriving and they're safe and that they have access to the same human rights, so to say. So I think that's an important piece. And as somebody who's worked inside local politics to get specific politicians elected, I have built relationships with members on the city council who, I have talked to and who I see and who we talk to about the issues. And I have, I've already gotten one endorsement from the county commission because I have relationship with the county commissioners, and when we see each other, we talk about these issues holistically and based on our, on our county and our city and how we, can always focus on making sure that we're looking at holistic improvement. So I feel like I've already built a lot of these relationships with the people who are in office. Even sometimes when it's adversarial and I'm holding them accountable, which I have done in the past, I feel like that's only strengthened our relationship because in general, they always know that I'm coming from a good place and they've been reflective of that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I did want to circle back to that.
Yeah, and it is an important question. I mean, because we've got that kind of cooperation, not only with other boards, but quite frankly, within the school board itself. How would you go about strengthening those relationships with the other board members? Because one board member has to work with all of them, okay,
right,
in order to get anything done.
Sure.
One person doesn't have the authority to just make decisions.
Yeah.
So how would you work with that?
So I think that's a good question. Again, I think it comes back to when you have your priorities aligned, like we're here, we're working for these people. This is our focus and this is what we care about. It's easier to get things done. So I sit on a board right now, like I mentioned, my CDD board. And when I went in there with a bunch of frustrations and I ran for the board because I felt like voices within my community, like myself, weren't being heard. But once I got on the board, and I was able to communicate with my fellow board members from a place that came from wanting to better our community and having shared goals, we worked together very well. And even when we disagreed on issues, I feel like we were able to respect each other and talk to each other in a way where, it wasn't a battle of egos, because what I do is I always go back to the issues and what we're focused on. And if you always go back to that and you're advocating for the right reasons for the actual voters and not for special interest or lobbyist or whoever, might be pulling the strings beforehand, it's so much easier to work together, and when in doubt, go back to your community. If you're divided on an issue, let your community lead you on which way that you should do that. And that's what I feel like I've tried to be a voice on my board is I may not always have the answer on, whether or not the wayfaring sign is big or the placement on it. But my answer is let's go back to our community and see what our community wants. And I think that I've helped lead my board to be more open, more connected to the community, more, transparent and less defensive, because I feel like one of the problems with politicians, as soon as they get elected, they get so used to people, giving them, attention and saying you're so great that when they get real criticism back from the community, they're so thin-skinned and they're defensive. And the first thing they do is defend themselves. And then they tout all the reasons why they're such a successful board, and they're not really listening and they're not leaning in. So I think fostering that attitude of like, we're here to represent the community and leaning in, and it's not about you and it's not about me. It's about our community and what's best for them. That's always a place of leading towards getting more stuff done.
And I'm glad you made that point, because it kind of leads to my next question. Elected officials tend to become disconnected
Absolutely.
from their community,
yes.
and constituents after they're elected. We see them at election time and then they become disconnected. So how do you plan to maintain that connection in your district?
Well, I feel like I've already built a lot of those relationships and I'm not elected, just in general, because I'm very transparent. Anybody who knows me knows how transparent I am. And I think making sure that you're accessible, I'm always the type of person that if somebody stops to ask me a question or they want more information, I stop what I'm doing and I get them that information and I respond to them. I'm always like, if you need more information, if you need more help, I'm here, making sure that people feel welcomed and open, to come to you and talk to you, not putting up a wall. I think part of the disconnect is like people want to stay electable, right? So they have to maintain this image to stay electable. And that creates a disconnect when you're trying to cultivate an image to maintain your electability. That's not something that's important to me, which may be a detriment in my campaign. But, what's important to me is connecting to people. When I go on forums and people are like, tell me about your platform, I say, well, here's my platform. But ultimately, what I want is your feedback on crafting my platform and being reflective about what people want. And I think if we have that attitude, and we thank people when they reach out to us and we make sure we're responsive to them and we lean in and we really listen when they have concerns, that, that element of really caring about your voters just naturally keeps you connected to them. And making sure that you're going to different parts. I mean, my district is huge, so we haven't necessarily touched on where the boundaries are, but it's basically all of North Tampa, North Hillsborough, east to west. It starts in Dover. It goes all the way through New Tampa. It touches the tip of Temple Terrace, goes all the way through Lutz, Carrollwood, parts of like Van Dyke and Cheval and out there. So it's gigantic. So making sure that you show up at these, community events where people go to really connect with their community. They may not connect with you, again, at downtown, at your office in the school board. So making sure you go to these different areas and that you're showing up in these communities. So people are like, oh yeah, there's, Jessica Vaughn. Let me talk to her about what happened today in my son's school that I, have an issue, and get her feedback, or, just making sure that you're there.
Well, I think that's important. I think it's important that the school board members get out to the schools, talk to the teachers, talk to the parents, really understand what's going on in their districts, particularly, but also in all of Hillsborough County.
Yeah, and the teachers, that's another a valid point, is making sure that you're staying connected to the teachers, because ultimately they have the most insights about what's happening in the classroom.
Well, that's right. I mean, they are the worker bees, if you will, who are there implementing all the strategies and everything else that the school board is trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
They're the ones doing it. So you're right. You need to listen to them. You mentioned how large a district that you have, mm-hmm. and it is a rather large and very, very diverse.
Very gerrymandered.
I mean, in the schools, I was looking through all the different schools, you have schools who have gotten A's mm-hmm. ratings for the last 5 or 6 years. You have some schools that are failing in there mm-hmm. as well, and they're all across the board. So I guess my question, one of the questions here is, what policies do you think need to be addressed immediately added that could impact your district?
Wow, that's a really good question. For me, when I get out to my community and I talk with my community about what issues they have, like I mentioned, safety is always at the forefront. Another thing that I don't hear a lot of school board members talking about or candidates. That seems to be a cross-partisan issue, and something that I'm faced with so much feedback about are so many people who have neurodiverse students or students that have disabilities that absolutely feel like they are being left behind and left out, and their children are struggling with what we have in place for them. So, for me, I'm super passionate about neurodiverse students. And when I say that, I mean students who learn differently. They might have ADHD or be on the spectrum or have dyslexia or, have a different, their brain learns in a different way. And I see so many students in the classroom, with teachers who are doing everything they can within their resources. They might have an IEP or a 504, and they might have different things that are there to try to help them learn. But overall, that environment is just not catered and not built towards the way that they learn. Sitting in a desk all day long, watching group lessons, as much as we try to include modality and pieces where students move around, that's a majority of some of it. And that's just not a good fit for every student. So for me, looking at our policies that affect, our students who, even if it's, ESOL or they have a learning as a second language, and we're talking about ways that, our inclusion program or immersive inclusion program is, or, different ways that we can support a lot of our students who are just falling through the cracks because our environment isn't aimed towards the way that they learn. So that's another thing that I'm passionate about. When we're talking about equity, people are throwing those words around, now like they're buzzwords, but really going in and talking about as a substitute teacher, not that far off from COVID, when I walk into a classroom and there's absolutely no hand wash, there's no hand soap and there's no paper towels for kids to wash their hands, that's an issue. So at the very beginning, really taking a look at these schools that don't have enough supplies and making sure we prioritize that for safety reasons alone is something that I would focus on and be passionate about. Another thing that I see that's, really everyone feels passionate about it is, how much exposure students are getting to like outside time and physical activity and PE and specials, and making sure that we're advocating for these pieces of giving students holistic learning, moving around, moving their bodies, being active, making sure we're exposing them to art and music and the different pieces of a holistic education are important. Also, what's important to me is nutrition, and making sure that when we're talking about school and we're talking about school safety, we're looking at it once again holistically, making sure that we don't have toxins in the things that we're buying, making sure that we're giving as much nutritional support to, our support staff in the cafeteria who are feeding our students. So again, making sure that we're looking at all our policies to examine that they're as inclusive, as supportive, and as holistic as possible would be my priorities.
Well, I'd like we're getting on into our time here, and I do want to talk about your candidacy and your campaign and campaigns in general. Tell us a little bit about why you are the best candidate as opposed to those who you're running against.
Well, this is a crowded race because the incumbent has moved on. So anytime you have an open seat where there's not an incumbent challenger, you're going to have a lot of candidates. And to be quite honest, there are some candidates I don't know a lot about. So I can tell you why I think I'm the best candidate in general is because I think that, number one, my experience combined, meaning experience as a parent of a neurodiverse student, as a community organizer who's been within the community advocating for these issues, as a CDD board member who's managed a large budget and infrastructure, all of these pieces that I've devoted my life to have helped prepared me to really be a good fit for this job. And then on top of that, I'm the type of person who, when I commit to something, I I prepare myself as much as possible. So while my post may be like, oh, look at, the shirts that I'm giving out to the broad coalition that we've built, which is something else I'd like to touch on. I'm also on the back end reading as many articles as I possibly can about community schools or our alternatives in the time of COVID to make sure that, we're asking for national funding, state funding to kind of fill in the gaps of what it's going to look like, because funding is going to be a huge issue when we talk about the ramifications of this pandemic. I'm looking at articles about ending the school to prison pipeline and different ways that we can talk about restorative discipline as opposed to punitive discipline when we're talking about, some of the issues within our school. So I'm really preparing myself. I'm talking with school board members. I had someone the other day who messaged me. It was on her birthday, and she said, what's the policy on, and creating diversity within our schools? Is there a mandate that so many, we want to encourage so many, Black teachers or women of color or, men within our schools? How are we working towards making sure that our staff is diverse in different schools? And I had to dig within the policies of the school board and go to the school board site and look at our diversity committee and see what the policies are. And, there's this little tiny line about goals about how they'd like to make our teaching staff more diverse, but no concrete answers on what that would look like. There's a non-discriminating policy, which people can't be discriminated against, but there's nothing in there that's necessarily encouraging diverse school staff. So I'm really someone who, when I commit to something, I prepare myself on every level, whether it's relationship building, whether it's doing my homework to make sure that I know what the best policies and up-to-date stuff is, whether or not it's just understanding that function of itself or reading bylaws and trying to figure out what that means. I'm somebody who prepares myself, because when I do something, I want to do it well and I want to be held accountable by my voters. And so, I'm going to put the work into that. So that answers your question. Before we run out of time, I do want to talk about charter schools and one of my opponents specifically that I'm concerned with, just so, our listeners are educated on that if we have time for it.
Oh, absolutely. Why don't, because one of my questions here is about campaign financing and, a question, and I think you pointed this out in some public posts, that, are board members allowed to accept contributions from developers and real estate companies and charter school companies as well? I mean, does that pose a conflict of interest?
So again, that's another good question. Are they allowed to? Legally, I guess, since we don't really have stringent campaign finance laws, they are legally allowed to, but once elected, you're definitely not supposed to. You're not supposed to be taking meetings with vendors and developers. That is the school's, your staff's job, so that you're not, influenced. We even have sunshine laws that are supposed to supposed to make sure that members who are on a board aren't having conversations privately about the issues. So, absolutely, that poses a conflict of interest, because you have to stop and ask yourself, if somebody's really dedicated to doing the right thing and dedicated to their voters, why would developers or why would contractors or why would lobbyists or why would consulting firms be donating the maximum amount of donations to these candidates' campaign? Why would they just give them money? Well, it's not a hard stretch. They give them money so that when they go into negotiations or there's a contract, are we going to allow this charter school to buy this sought after piece of land, to put a school on it and develop on there for a minuscule price with some federal funds? Are we going to allow that to happen? Well, if that developer is giving you, $20,000 between different shell corporations, you're obviously going to vote in favor of them opening up a charter school and getting that land. Or you look at some candidate's campaign and you're like, why is this, lawn company giving the candidate $1,000? That's a lot for a lawn company. And then you realize, well, there's going to be contracts of who's going to mow our school lawns and who are we going to give those contracts to. So when you see a candidate who's taking large contributions from companies that have vested interest, unless you're watching really closely, it's really easy for them to then, quick pro quo, make these changes and vote in favor of these companies when contracts come due or when we're talking about negotiation or land use. And unfortunately, that's what our school board has been a majority of, people who are just essentially selling out their vote to the highest bidder. And that's what's gotten us in so much trouble in the first place.
Well, I agree. I see that as a great conflict of interest in any candidate who's willing to take those monies, because it just calls into question how can they truly be
unbiased,
fair, unbiased. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. How can they truly be unbiased and or even seem to be unbiased in that situation?
Well, here's the thing. Here's a caveat. They hope that nobody's paying attention. I mean, how many voters do you know, even one, who know who's running in what race and when the election is, much less where to access their campaign finance reports, or how to look at it, or what when I first got involved, I would pull school board members' campaign contributions and I'd be like, wow, they have a lot of realtor friends. They must have been involved in real estate at some point. I'm the daughter of a realtor, so I was like, oh, and then it took me a while to understand, oh, it's not their friends with real estate companies. These real estate companies are counting on their vote when they make bids and for development. So I think that they count on people not knowing that. But on top of it, one of my opponents has not only been brazen enough to accept these, but then he remasked his fundraising as an outpouring of community support. So, he somehow get someone to write an article saying he's raised $40,000 and wow, he's so overwhelmed by community support. People are going to read that article and assume he got thousands of donations from voters, when in fact he really almost got no donations from actual small donations from voters. But it's like they're brazen enough to not only raise it, but mask it as something else and hope that nobody calls them out on it, because nobody has.
Well, and I agree. I think a lot of people running for office really depend on the ignorance of the voter.
Yes.
And again, that's one of the reasons we're doing this podcast.
Absolutely.
Is to help people get educated and understand what's going on.
Yes.
We are beginning to run down into some time, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to discuss kind of your vision for education in our communities, or anything else that we didn't discuss that you'd like to discuss.
Thank you. Well, we had touched on charter schools, and I want to come back to that, because whenever I look at forums, or the feedback that I've gotten is people want to know your stance on charter schools. And I want to use this opportunity to kind of educate people on my stances, and specifically, why I have them. Charter schools originally, I think, were a great idea, and they were created to give the community and schools an opportunity to try alternative education in these safe environments and learn and take those education philosophies, if they were successful, back to public school and use those to strengthen public schools. Okay. Then at some point, the powers that be got a brilliant idea that they could use these charter schools to essentially give people the illusion of choice, pass laws that essentially have handicapped and weakened our public schools, so that they set these schools up to be failing, and then masquerade and bring in these charter schools as an option and a choice, because everybody likes choice. But really, a majority of them are for-profit charter schools that are going to be managed by private boards that are really out here because they've realized that if we masquerade this option of choice in all of these areas where people feel choiceless when it comes to education, that they will be able to privatize and profit off our education system. And if that doesn't set alarms off in everybody's brain when they hear that, then, I don't know really what to say to that, because privatizing anything, as we've seen with the legislation when they're talking about getting teachers right out of high school so that they can pay them less and watering them down, means that we're going to get less quality so that stakeholders and people who profit can get more money. So what I think that we need to do is, when we're talking about school choice, is educate our listeners that, number one, yes, I support school choice. We already have it. We have schools that any school that you can try to choice into if there are openings, that you can, basically have a choice. Now, where that complicates things, what if you can't make it across town to another school? And that's not an option for you. How are you going to guarantee that your child has access to quality public education? So I understand a lot of these communities that are embracing charter schools because that's their only hope at making sure that they have a safe, good education for their students. For their children, for our students. But the problem therein lies that, okay, if we're going to have charter schools and that's going to be a focus, number one, we should make sure they're not for profit. Number two, let's use these charter schools to do what they were meant to do. And that is to try out alternative education. If we're going to prioritize charter schools, let's open up charter Montessori schools. They have one in Pasco. It's very successful. Montessori schools are a great alternative to students who are neurodiverse or who suffer for trauma. And we should have those schools that are accessible in communities that can't afford to pay for them. Because right now, alternative educations like that, Waldorf schools, Montessori schools, are only accessible to communities that can afford to pay for that extra education. So when we talk about equity, and if we're talking about a focus on charter schools, let's use these non-profit charter schools to allow communities that can't afford it to have access to these alternative education ideas. But when we talk about privatizing education, a lot of what happens are these charter schools come in to communities, especially communities in urban areas where that real estate, the community is starting to gentrify, and that real estate is important and they don't want to pay a lot of money for it. So they say, let's open a charter school. We're going to come in this community. We're going to tell all these people, we're going to give them technology and the best teachers. And they sign up for these charter schools that absolutely have no standardization in general of the curriculum that they're putting together, the infrastructure that we've built within public schools, and they fail in a couple years and they close, and those students go back into the public school, and then the developers get to keep that land that they paid almost nothing for, and our communities are hurt even more. So, we really have to weed through this misinformation of school choice and charter schools and what they mean, because the more that we privatize education, what that means is less access. It means that these charter schools, if they are successful, are going to make sure that their boards pick the brightest, most successful students so that they can have the higher ratings. And then we come right back to the inequity. Only the public school options for the people who can't get into these charter schools are even worse because we've defunded and devalued public education. So what we really need to do is we need to take all this energy that we're putting into charter schools being successful and make our public schools successful like that. Why can't we do that? Why aren't we focusing on making our public schools as successful? If we can throw up these charter schools that have funding from the government, why can't we access that funding and make our public schools as successful? So I think that people need to be very weary, when they push these charter schools as school choice, of what that really means and the danger that it coincides with when we're talking about public education. So,
and I think it's an important point, because I also did some research on the school board site itself, looking at what kind of oversight does the school board have on charter schools. And quite honestly, as a contract manager for many, many years, I would say the board has very little insight. They are only mandated one visit annually to see the school to make sure that it's working properly. The quarterly financials are not even audited. They're unaudited financial statements, which essentially means the school can say anything they want.
Yeah, that's crazy.
There's just so many things that looking at the oversight.
Yeah.
There was very little oversight. Well, in addition to that, if looking at some other research, is that there was some awards that were given for the top schools, and in Hillsborough there were about 12 schools that were awarded top ranking, and of those, 11 were public schools. One was a charter school. That kind of tells me that that if charter schools were really coming up to what they said they would be and do, then they would have been in at least 3 or 4 or 5 positions in those rankings.
Right.
So it to me, it is an important thing, and I certainly appreciate your views on that.
Well, I think it will be interesting. And again, there are some good charter schools. Pepin is an amazing charter school in Hillsborough County. Learning Gate, a great school, great models, things that we could take into our inclusive classrooms, our mainstream classrooms. I think it will be interesting to see the candidates who will, at the forefront of their platform, talk about accountability, but at the same time push these charter schools that have less accountability. And I think people need to look at that connection, that you can't logistically be pro accountability and then be pro charter school, because as you've pointed out, they have less accountability than our public schools do. So I think that that's a good connection that we could make.
Very good. Is there anything else? Because I would like to give you the opportunity, and we're getting on into our time here. Is there anything else that you'd like to discuss?
I would just like to let our listeners know, like I said, I think it's important to look at who's supporting a candidate when you look at their financial contributions. We've had over 100 small donations. Our support has built such a broad coalition of supporters from people of different partyships. I have Republicans, Libertarians, Democrats, some of who I have argued with on opposite sides of the table, all be like, we're supporting you. We know you have the best intentions, a good heart. You're passionate. How can I help you? Our coalition ranges from age demographics. We have different races, it's just so broad between how much support we've got. And I'm overwhelmed by that and so appreciative. I want to emphasize the fact of, how our campaign has resonated in places that I didn't expect. But also that, one thing I think people should be looking at when they're looking at a candidate isn't someone who necessarily has all the answers per se, because nobody has all of the answers. But I can tell you right now that if I don't have the answer, I'm the type of person who's going to surround myself with people who do have the answers and who help lift me up. And that, it's kind of cliche now within the progressive movement, but this campaign really isn't just about me. It's about us and the community. I use that word community so much in everything that I do, because I think that's important, is making a connection that we are all connected, and that, somebody who's running for office should be looking out for all of us, not a certain portion of us, not people who's going to help them who vote more or a certain demographic, but for all of us. And that's really what our campaign is about. That's what I'm about, being as reflective and building coalitions and building relationships and finding out the information and surrounding myself with people who are experts in this field and gathering their input, and I think that's what we should be valuing when we're looking at candidates, not just a popularity contest or, my uncle went to school with him and he was a nice guy, or, we should really be looking at who's able to prepare themselves for the job, who can build the relationships, who surrounds themselves with the right people, and who's a reflective leader. At least that's what I think, and that's what I value. That's the type of campaign I'm committed to running. So I want the listeners to know that about me personally. One other thing that I did want to mention was that I have had the honor of being endorsed by County Commissioner Mariella Smith, who, if anybody follows her, she's just amazing, one of the most popular county commissioners on the board. And like I said, I'm just honored to be endorsed by her. That means a lot. So I just wanted to make sure I did let our audience know about that.
Well, thank you. So how can people contact you, or how can they volunteer? Where do they need to go to contact you and volunteer to help your campaign?
So thank you for that opportunity. First of all, this is a grassroots campaign. When we're talking about developers not taking developer money, I don't even have developers offering me money. So it's not something I'm conflicted about. They know right off the bat that, that I'm not for sale. So that's not an option. So, continual contributions is so important. I hate to put money at the forefront. I hate that money is an important component of campaigns. But, if my opponent can spend $30,000 to get a billboard sign or put giant signs everywhere or do more advertising, every penny that my campaign gets means it's more voters that I can reach with our message. So going to jessicavaughn.us is my campaign website. People can learn more about me. They can learn about the school board, and I would love for them to hit that donate and contribute button. And it doesn't have to be a lot of money. I can't tell you how many $10 contributions I've gotten, and I'm appreciative of every single penny because $10 donations is $100. So it all adds up. So first of all, if anybody can afford to contribute to my campaign, thank you. I will use the money responsibly, and I will make sure that we reach as many voters as possible. They can also, I'm looking for volunteers. We're going to have sign wavings coming up. We're going to have phone bankings coming up. I need people to help with fundraising in a different level. We're going to do lit drops. We're not going to do full-on canvassing because I don't want to expose my volunteers to anything. And we are getting customized masks that will offer the volunteers because safety is a number one concern of my campaign. But I need people, on the ground getting out my message. I'm not going to be able to do that on the scale of some of my other opponents. So I also have a huge social media on Facebook specifically page. People can like my become friends with me on Facebook. They can like my school board campaign. I also have an Instagram and a Twitter that we're trying to kind of get up and off the ground running if that's the way that people like to connect to people. And ultimately, they can call me. My phone number is 813-857-1571. So sometimes that's the best way to reach me. Pick up the phone and call me with what you're concerned with. You can email me, jvaughn30@gmail.com, or, come and say hello to me when you see me at the grocery store.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for being on our show. Thank you for answering the questions. I appreciate your candor on those. And certainly wish you the best of luck with your campaign.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for agreeing to interview me. Like I said, it's been surreal to be on the other end of the microphone. But it really helps me hopefully get my message out to voters. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this all the way from North Carolina. There's magic going into making this possible, right?
Absolutely. And I do want to say one final thing to those who are listening to our podcast. It is extremely important that you, as a voter, get out and vote in your local elections, in the national elections. And it's very important at this time that you get yourself registered to vote by mail. It's easy to do in Hillsborough County. I have to take my hat off to the supervisor of elections.
Mm-hmm. Craig Latimer.
He has done a great job with the website. Voting by mail, you can track your vote, see when they receive it, see when they count it. It's in my opinion, a wonderful way to vote. But the point is that you got to get out and vote.
Absolutely.
So please get out and vote. These local elections are just as important as the national ones. In fact, and I would say, and more important in many cases, because these people directly impact you.
Can I give some voting information real fast?
Oh, absolutely.
Sorry. Thank you for going there. Normally, that's like the forefront of what I'm telling people. So the election for your local candidates, there is August 18th on 2020. There will be a primary / runoff, which means if it's a partisan race, it's a closed primary, so you have to register as either a Democrat or a Republican to vote for those positions. But my race is nonpartisan, so you don't need to register as anything. We'll be on your ballot. And what happens is there are 6 candidates right now who have qualified. If none of the candidates get over 50% plus 1 vote, the 2 candidates that have the highest number of votes will then go on to the general election, which will be November 3rd. So you have an opportunity, maybe, depending on who wins the runoff, to vote for your candidate twice. So the primary runoffs are really important to narrowing it down and making sure whoever you want even goes on and continues to the next race. And also voting by mail for people who have any concerns about it. In Hillsborough County, as Ken mentioned, we have an amazing supervisor of election. You can track your ballot 100% to make sure that it's counted. If there's any problems with that, you can see it online and have it cured. You can also take your ballot in and change it for your vote by mail ballot and exchange it for an actual ballot. If you love voting in person, it's better to make sure you have one that comes to you in the mail that you can always take if you want to make that choice. But if something happens and COVID-19 resurfaces and we have a second wave and we're not able to get in the polls, please make sure you're signed up to vote by mail so that your voice can be counted. Sometimes in these primary elections, we only have a 20% turnout as a norm, that there's only 1/5 of our population choosing who our candidates are even going to be. So thank you so much for reminding me about that, Ken, and talking about voter education, because ultimately that's the most important thing.
And I agree. And so, folks, if you're not registered to vote by mail, please do, because we don't know what the situation is going to be with COVID-19. And as Jessica pointed out, if everything's fine and we have all of our polling places open, you can just walk in, either drop off your ballot, or you can walk in and exchange it and go in and vote like you normally would. But if we have to close a lot of polling places, or people are just not showing up at those, then you have that opportunity to have your voice counted. So please take that into consideration when you're considering all this. And again, it's these local candidates and these local races are extremely important. Please pay attention.
Yeah, we have a bigger impact on voters' lives immediately than anything on the national level.
Right.
So thank you.
Again, Jessica, thank you again. And I guess we'll say goodbye.
Oh, I hate parting in such sweet sorrow. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of the listeners. I really appreciate it. Thanks again.